Well, so I'm just going to quickly go through this article here, given it was published not that long ago by two of the three main perpetrators of critical race theorist subversion across Scottish academia. The two in question out of the three being Melina, my favourite boo boo, and Zut Utamani. The third, for anybody that's not aware, Kajida Mohammed. I was very upset that she didn't make an appearance this time around, but it's remarkable how all these months later, they're still referring to incidents that occurred several months ago, incidents that they completely took out of context deliberately and lied about, had the mainstream media backing them up along the way, insinuating that people calling them out on Twitter for some of the things that they were putting out and celebrating, such as pushing to diversify the teaching workforce, people simply calling out their tweets, questioning their tweets, that was brushed aside and deemed racist and abusive, etc. Then the blocking followed swiftly after, and then a few weeks later, if that, we had the primary school photo, where people simply pointed out in the photograph of Nicola Sturgeon in a classroom full of BAMEs that it was questionable demography. You know, that was how it managed to be deemed racist, etc., etc. But what I find remarkable is, after all these months, they've never been able to stamp up any proof to showcase just how much abuse was clearly on display, despite the fact they keep referring to it. And you know damn well if they had proof of the claims that they insist are real, they would have provided it by now. Because these are the same people, funnily enough, and it seems to have gone over their head to some degree. These are the same people that refer to incidents that occurred months ago to continue to justify why they need to continue pushing this nonsense in our schools. But yet they can't manage to muster up any actual proof at all for the claims they make. And you know damn well they would if they could, because they're referring to incidents that occurred months ago, but they never actually provide anything of substantial evidence. Anyway, so anti racism is a collective responsibility in education, key messages. And the people in question are, as I said, Melina and Nazutu Tamani. Four educators spell out how they responded to online abuse directed at both a primary school and presenters at a learning festival. And right off the bat, it says here, in September, presenters hosting the Scottish Learning Festival anti-racism presentations were subjected to a barrage of racist abuse online. Later that month, a Glasgow primary school was similarly targeted after it tweeted about a visit from Scotland's First Minister Thidlips. Now, four educators who were subjected to those abusive messages, or who have close knowledge of those events, have come together to outline how their sector can and did respond. And first of all, we have a wee trigger warning here for anybody. This article contains descriptions of racism and white supremacist beliefs that can be upsetting and triggering. So, first of all, we have Melina, who works for Education Scotland as a programme lead for the Building Racial Literacy Programme, a critical race theorist professional learning programme funded by the Scottish Government, masquerading as simply being an anti racist professional learning programme. When I woke up, Melina speaking here, when I woke up to messages checking if I was okay, I braced myself. After a Scottish Learning Festival session in September on decolonising the curriculum, I had become the target of Twitter trolls. Oh, yeah, simply trolling because they had the temerity to call out what you were celebrating on Twitter, as she herself admits here to some degree. We had ran an SLF, or Scottish Learning Festival session, on diversifying the teaching profession with the Rainbow Unicorn Government's Diversity in the Teaching Profession and Education Workforce Working Group, and I had tweeted about it. This was in the context of only 1.8% of teachers identifying as being BAME, far from the 4% target set by the Scottish Government as that proportionate representation. Watch how that will go up. That target will go up when the next census comes out. You know? Why is this a thing? Nobody ever seems to explain that. Why that has to be a thing. And it's funny how, until such a time as it is a thing, things will always be deemed unequal. And in order to achieve this target, they have to shaft white people or Scottish people. And then this bit here, right? A parent on Twitter posted their outrage that they were promoting, that we were promoting there to be less Scottish teachers in Scotland. I challenged this misconception that only white people can be Scottish. Overnight, my post was mobbed. To those trying to challenge them all, I tweeted that these were white supremacist trolls not worth our time. So I don't have a screenshot of her actual tweet, but as she made reference to it, was pointing out the fact that things were being put into place, or there was more calls to put things into place to get that proportionate representation up a gear. 4% of the population at the time, according to the 2011 census, was BAME, but the 4% of the teaching workforce ain't BAME yet. So we need to put things into place. So somebody at the top here, top right, said, so promoting there to be less Scottish teachers in Scotland is anti-racist. I can't imagine being so filled with hatred that I would migrate to a country and act in such a truly despicable way. And this was the parent that Melina was referring to there. Such an abusive tweet. You can clearly see this, you know? The hyperbole is just off the charts with these individuals. So only white people can be Scottish, she says. I can't imagine being so filled with hatred for black people and people of colour. So right off the bat, gaslighting, straw man. At what point did the individual in question here make any reference to a disdain, a dislike, or even an indifference to BAMEs? Simply pointed out the obvious that Scottish people are an ethnic group, similar in stock to the Irish, etc. You know, there which just happens that we're white. Black people can't be Scottish. They can have British citizenship, but they will never ever be Scottish. It's as simple as that. It's not racist. It's a fact. And in order to get this target of 4% of the teaching workforce being BAME to reflect 4% of, according to the census, you have to, by extension, shaft white people, because it's not white people filling these job roles that will allow you to reach your targets. So where exactly is the tweet in question wrong? And where exactly was there any reference to a dislike or a hatred for black people? But this is what they do. The person in question then responded again by saying, so promoting there to be, no, sorry, that's the same thing. Then Nazutu Tamani comes on underneath and says, what's your definition of a Scottish teacher? White, I assume. Who said there should be less Scottish teachers, as you put it? The workforce should properly represent the children it teaches. Why would you have a problem with that? Let's flip that on its head. Why would you have a problem with the fact that currently at present, Scottish schools are too white? Because fundamentally, what they're doing here is they're flipping it on its head and making it appear as if anybody that calls out their nonsense, if anybody has a temerity to do that, they're the ones with the problem. And this is what caused all this ruckus back in September. People simply throwing it back at them, making them accountable for once, calling them out simply. Tweet after tweet after tweet for a few weeks. Similar in nature to the one I've got on screen. But yet that's managed to have been painted up and revised in history in a historical context to be that of abusive in nature. You know? And then she says here, why would you have a problem with that? Not all non-white folk are migrants. P.S. Not all non-white folk are migrants. Like, I come in, of course, this is what got me blocked. I said, I would have an issue with Polish people constantly whining and moaning that Scottish schools didn't have enough Polish teachers. Nothing to do with white. But they don't. It's always you lot. You think you're intellectual and oppressed. You're not. You're odious. Well, that got me blocked by both of them, may I add. One troll argued that white supremacist is a slur against white people. And presumably the person you're referring to here simply responded to you referring to them as a white supremacist, or a troll, or both. It really shouldn't go without saying that calling out racism does not mean being anti-white. See, again, this is what they're doing, because you're not calling out racism, are you? You never have been calling out racism. What you have been doing is redefining the term racism. It's now got several different definitions, while you and your cohorts simultaneously berate and attack whiteness to no end, revise our history, and insist that things need to change and become more equitable in nature. Anybody that has an issue with these things, these policies, these educational drives, they are somehow the problem. It really shouldn't go without saying that calling out racism does not mean being anti-white. But the whole premise of what you are doing centers around attacking whiteness. And any white person that has the temerity to call you out is in fact deemed racist. The trolls were expressing the white supremacist belief that only white people can be Scottish. And even that in and of itself is somewhat misleading, because Polish people can't be Scottish, German people can't be Scottish, French people can't be Scottish. It just so happens that we all fall under the same category of white, appearance-wise. It's not a myth. It's not a white supremacist belief. It's a fact. The very people who claim to no end that race doesn't exist and, in fact, ethnicity is all that matters and ethnicity is a real thing, then I don't really understand where the misconception is coming into effect here. It's not a myth at all. Take a DNA test, dickhead. But you won't do that, will you? It's better to just dismiss everybody as being a troll and racist. To them, I love this as well. Nobody at any point said this, by the way. Nobody at any point has said this on the threads that took place at the time on Twitter. To them, mixing is illegitimate, and in their minds, mixed race people with Scottish ancestry aren't ethnically Scottish. Nobody at any point said that, at all. And as I said, they would provide proof. If that had been said, there would be articles about it, there'd be government officials talking about it. You would never hear the end of it. It never happened. This is them again using everything within their power to manipulate whoever has the time in their hands to read this shit. Because they can't provide an honest, well-to-do argument, because nothing that they stand for has any credibility. It's all deceptive, malevolent, and manipulative in nature. Nobody at any point said that. Total straw man bullshit. But of course, a white person, just because they're white, can't be Scottish, the same way a black person can't be Scottish. You either are or you are not. And if somebody has a Scottish parent and an African parent, well, they're half Scottish. It's pretty simple. So, whatever. And then they say here, as was also seen in the racist abuse faced by St. Albert's Primary School, only days later, there are mentions of white genocide and replacement theory. Extremists fear that migration and interracial procreation are forcing white people to disappear. Such narratives are breeding grounds for white supremacist radicalization, and it's because of them that as a biracial person, I've been called a witch, an invader, a disgusting replacer, a mongrel, and a parasite. A troll was quick to point out that I identify as Franco-Indian, so why do I even care? Well, it's remarkable how, on the one hand, we're told to no end that Scotland's future is brown. In fact, there was an article that came out just last year from a brown demographer, one of the world's best, apparently. He said the future of Scotland's Asian. And then, of course, we look at the demographic trends that are taking place in the vast majority of European countries. Birth rates are on the decline, while simultaneously, in your part of the world, where your family originate from, or half of it anyway, birth rates are on the rise. Yeah, goes without saying, does it not? And then when we have government policy being put into place, or at the very bare minimum suggested and advocated for to be put into place for replacement migration, simple mathematics would showcase that if the trends continue unabated, then in time, the balance will tip. But as a conspiracy theorist, if someone like myself brings it up, but it's absolutely acceptable for everybody else to bring it up, provided they're celebrating it. Anyway, and I care because Scotland has become my home, and that's remarkable, really. So you come to Scotland, and you and your friends, like Kajita, for example, complain to no end that institutions are too white. And because they're too white, that means that there is barriers in place and systemic racism, etc., etc., etc. You spend the entirety of your career, your measly fucking existence, trying your damnedest to subvert our academia with the sole intention of promoting critical race theory to children. You are a fucking parasite. A disgusting parasite. Every single one of you people who push this shit and believe that it's necessary. You're disgusting. I care because I know the damaging effects these racist narratives have on learners, educators, families, and entire communities. Oh yeah, that's right. Because Melina, of course, for anybody that's not aware, you can read this shit on her anti-racist educator website, all her blogs. She went away to America to learn all about critical race theory, then came back here scratching her head as to why there wasn't that much materials here. She couldn't quite fathom why the American extremist ideology of critical race theory hadn't quite found its footing here yet. So she took it upon herself to move to Scotland and begin to implement it. Yeah, maybe there's a reason it wasn't as clear cut as you thought it would be. Maybe there's a reason it wasn't everywhere else apart from American university campuses. Because it's a fucking ideology that was created out of nothing. Anyway, she's witnessed parents afraid of complaining about racism in schools for fear of being told to leave if they're not happy in Scotland. Well, this is all anecdotal nonsense, as far as I'm concerned. Provide the proof. Again, I'll just say this much. Maybe it is true, but I beg to differ. And until such a time as proof is provided, proof that they would be quite happy to showcase, then it's just anecdotes, really. Very convenient anecdotes, don't you think? Because they perpetuate such an outlandish, hyperbolic narrative, but yet they've always got convenient, anecdotal examples to strengthen their arguments. It's very peculiar. Some may argue bullshit. I've heard too many accounts of children trying to whiten their skin in Scotland. Whiten their skin in Scotland. Don't believe it at all. Absolutely do not believe that. And educators having their professional judgment questioned because of their accent, skin colour, and hijab. All right, okay. Well, is there any proof to these claims, or is this the inferiority complex of some of these anti-racist teachers? Maybe it's that, but nah, it's because I was babe. It was, however, the first time in my career that so many education institutions had called out racist abuse with public statements of solidarity. Oh, yes, I remember them well. Oh, yeah. For example, the EIS came out around about the time, and it's funny how they will bring up things like this, like, oh, several institutions backed us up and called out this horrible abuse. Well, it's the same principle applies, for example, in the Scottish Parliament when you hear SNP politicians bragging about the fact that the vast majority of the Parliament voted for whatever amendment or whatever policy this time around, whether it's climate change targets or more recently the gender reform bill. They'll brag about the fact that the vast majority of the Parliament all vote the same way. Well, that doesn't mean that the things that you're voting for are indeed, in any shape or form, actually beneficial, advantageous, or indeed fucking correct in nature. No, it simply means that the vast majority of the Parliament share the same ideology as the one that was responsible for conjuring up said bills in the first place. Same principle applies here, of course, because the very same people who wrote this nonsense from the EIS in and of itself, and every other institution or politician that got involved during this timescale, they all share the same ideology as poor little Melina and Nizutu Tamani, etc., etc. Anyway, just to read a wee bit of this, it says, following a presentation at the Scottish Learning Festival last week, focusing on anti-racism in education and diversifying the education profession, aka pushing for less whites, more browns in schools, several of our members and Education Scotland staff were subjected to vile online racist abuse that none of them at any point have been able to provide proof of. Nah, it's simply people calling out their narrative and they can't handle it. So, of course, the EIS condemned the abuse and all forms of racism. And then it says, just a wee bit further down, conversations about anti-racism in education are crucial to achieve an equitable education system for all, and the target abuse levelled at those speaking out is a stark illustration of this. So you call out critical race theory, that justifies why we need more critical race theory. Of course, makes sense. Racism in Scotland isn't just a matter of a few trolls. On the Building Racial Literacy programme, we share the story of the child who said she didn't expect her experiences of racism to change because she lives in Scotland, a white person country. Again, I mean, how old was this kid in question, if this is even a true story? Very convenient that these are the sort of things that they insinuate the people calling them out would have come out and said, Scotland's a white person country. Then conveniently there's this invisible unnamed child who said something identical. However, this was not a result of being exposed to trolls, but of wider messages of inferiority and superiority, of belonging and not belonging, which are communicated by our collective biases, behaviours, and practices, according to the critical race theorist, who more often than not actually just refers to other critical race theorists as opposed to actually having any critical thoughts of her own. It's funny how that works, you specky boot. Racism is our collective problem. Anti-racism is our collective responsibility. Oh, how lovely. How lovely jubbly is that worded. Yeah. And this is the quote that's been branded about Twitter now as bold and brave and stunning and progressive, Reality of the matter is, though, if you go onto the Anti-Racist Educators website, Molina's old website, they make reference on 2 occasions from memory to a colourblind society that Scotland at present was. Not so much now, because we never hear the end of fucking racism, but for a time, it was colourblind, aka people didn't see race, aka we lived in a meritocracy, and guess what? That was deemed as problematic. So we can't have it both ways. If we lived in a problematic colourblind society, how can it be in any shape or form possible for it to also simultaneously be the case that Scotland is deemed to be a white person country where senses or messages of inferiority and superiority are rife? Is it more acceptable to assume that this is just the ramblings of lunatics who call themselves experts? Yeah. Then we have a head teacher who responded to racist attacks. that didn't exist, by the way. It was a good day, a proud day for our children who were hosting First Minister Thin Lips as she led a National Assembly on climate change. Yes, that's right. Thin Lips with her ball cat turned up at a school to talk about climate change to children. She spent time with our children and parents, spoke to staff, made us feel listened to and important. And then it started. What can only be described as a tsunami of abuse. People, some more crass than others, and when I say crass, I don't mean because you'll get somebody going, aha, so you're conceding that there was racism. No, I just mean that some people were a bit more to the bone than others when it came to simply calling out or questioning the appearance of the demography in the photo. You know, one white kid, two, if I'm not mistaken, a wee girl at the back, a wee white boy at the front, the rest of the class brown and black. This is Scotland, of course, a historically white nation. It's always been that way, but now all of a sudden, this is totally normal. You can't point it out. Oh no. Nobody was targeting the children at all or saying anything untoward. They were simply pointing out the demography. That was it. That's racist. You can't do that. So then, of course, it says here, encompassing white supremacist ideology around replacements. Well, is it not replacement? Because 20, 30 years ago, that school would have been all white. Now it's what, 90%, if not more than that, BAME? And that's just one school of many, an ever increasing amount as the years go on. I mean, every single census that comes out now, albeit it's not going up at an exponential rate yet, the BAME percentage increases, and this is applicable in every other Western nation, more or less. The white percentage isn't increasing at the same time. No, it's not. For a decade now, Scotland's had record new population levels, year on year, all due to immigration as our birth rate plummets simultaneously. Wow, doesn't take a genius. Death threats didn't exist. That didn't exist. Not at all. In fact, if I recall, because I made a video on it at the time, when the head teacher reported this incident to the police, there wasn't even mentions of a death threat then. Cruel images designed to promote the idea of a white-only Scotland. There was one image, if I remember correctly. It was on my old video, but I'm pretty sure it was a joke or a meme. It wasn't anything that would be deemed cruel, but this is what we're dealing with here. All directed at 8-year-old children. That wasn't, though. It was just simply pointing out demographics. Rightly or wrongly, just saying. These people are trying to infer that there was a slew of absolutely heinous, disgusting tweets targeting children specifically because they were brown and black, and it was just simply people pointing out the demography of the photo. In that moment, I had to decide whether to stand up for the hundreds of public racist attacks against the children I worked for, or put it down to trolling and hope it went away in the belief that today's news is tomorrow's chip paper. I chose the former, and it was the right thing to do. I wrote a statement. Oh, you're so bold. You're so brave. This particular attack, of course, even the words, while shocking in volume and venom, was one of many our school communities experienced over the years. On reflection, the saddest part for me is that I wasn't surprised, and neither were our parents, fighting, surviving, living with racism, whether overt, systemic, online, in a queue at the shops, on public transport, in your fucking imagination, is the lived experience of most of our school community. Most of our school community, because, they have a problem with people pointing out the demography of the photo, but yet the individual in question here has just indirectly or subtly referred to the demography of the photo by telling you that most of the school community experienced the alleged racism in all its different forms. Most, of course, being BAME. So were the people in the photo not doing the exact same thing that this person that wrote that paragraph has just done? It's so easy to pull their shit apart, but you can't have a debate with them because you're just deemed racist. So, let me see. I don't give a shit when you qualified. I can't fix everything, but I can create a space where I, all our staff, and our parents have a voice to change things. I can work towards silencing the silenced. I made a decision to stand up to racism. That means that I advocate a complete overhaul of our curriculum and a renewed focus on the 4 capacities of Scotland's curriculum for excellence. Well, it's funny how all these things were in the pipeline prior to these alleged racist incidents, so don't hand me that one. Because within those are the skills and knowledge we need to create a meaningful and lasting progress towards an equitable, not equal, oh no, that's problematic, folks, an anti-racist system. Yeah. We must learn to be culturally responsive and create a strong Scotland that draws from the talents, skills, thoughts, and beliefs of all who live here. As an educator, this is my mission, and I will use my voice for this. And I'm just going to scroll down a bit to Nizut Utamani because I understand this is getting a bit long now. But I like this bit here as well. The debate on Brexit, followed by the rise of populist politicians, has made it more acceptable to adopt extreme views. Even worse, social media has given those extreme views a vocal platform. People say things online that they wouldn't in person. Emboldened keyboard warriors. In the echo chamber of social media, there is always someone who will agree with an extreme position. Yeah, okay. It's funny because they just deem absolutely everything that opposes their progressive worldview extreme. Calling out extreme views, pot kettle black, like when we see them isn't enough. We need to increase the pace of change. So I love this, right? The very start of this article, I want to highlight this bit. The very start of this article, right? Melina refers to people, one in particular, a parent, as she referred to him as, uh, calling her out, albeit she said it was abuse and trolling and whatnot, because she'd mentioned diversity in the teaching profession. I had tweeted about it. This was in the context of only 1.8% of teachers identifying as being from a black, Asian, and or minority BAME background, far from the 4% target set by the government. That 4% target, of course, derives from the census at the time, 2011 census, 4% BAME, therefore 4% of the teaching workforce has to be BAME. That started the abuse, alleged abuse. A parent obviously posted their outrage that we were promoting there to be less Scottish teachers in Scotland, right? So then you come down to this paragraph here, though. So after all this diatribe, this absolute fucking waffle, you get. So after all the extreme views that we've just spoken about and all the evil racism, etc., 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 what we need to do is increase the pace of change so that our workforce is more diverse and represents our communities, especially in Glasgow. Oh, that'll stop all the evil racism that they claim exists. Oh yeah, it's funny how that always seems to be their go-to solution. You know, this is why they want to promote to no end the revisionist version of events in terms of slavery, etc. Let's not talk about any other form of slavery. Now, let's focus solely on transatlantic slavery. And then when they can get that into the curriculum to such a degree that they deem acceptable, they will go, well, because of all that racism back in the day, and this is why we're still hard done by today, aka let's BMR teaching workforce. Everything's about putting things into place to prioritize their own. It's a power grab. All dressed up neat and nice as a means to simply eradicate racism. A paragraph just starts off totally null and void as far as I'm concerned. Calling out extreme views isn't enough. We need to increase the pace of change so that our workforce is more diverse. We need to understand the impact of racism on colleagues and young people in our schools. If you ask children and young people the same question, which question? If you ask head teachers if they have a problem with bullying in their school, I suspect most would say it would happen, but they deal with it quickly and effectively. If you ask kids the same question, I wonder if you would get the same response. I wonder too about young people's experience of racism. I wonder about white kids' experiences of racism because we're not allowed to talk about that. And funnily enough, the very people who claim that they're simply promoting anti-racism have already deemed the concept of whites being the victims of racism impossible. Yeah, you can be prejudiced. Oh, yeah, but you can't be racist. I don't give a shit when you were in secondary school. So Nizut Uzamani finishes us off here by saying, in the aftermath of the racist abuse towards myself and colleagues, I made a statement at a session of Education Scotland's Building Racial Literacy programme, in which I've been a part of. I express my gratitude, yada yada, but I encourage colleagues to think about what happens next. Friends and colleagues who are not impacted directly by racism in their daily lives will make statements of support, then carry on with the rest of their day. However, what we want you to do, the same way that they wanted you to do the exact same thing when George Floyd died, was to ensure that all of the momentum that was generated is then built upon because they don't want that momentum to die down. Same fucking thing is what she's saying there by that statement. However, I and others who are subjected to such hate cannot move on. Instead, we are left carrying the burden of discrimination and hate. So 2 incidents that had absolutely no racism whatsoever, no abuse whatsoever, no quote-unquote trolling whatsoever, nothing at all, has somehow justified the wording such as subjected to such hate and we can't move on. We've been left carrying the burden. such hyperbole and malevolent bullshit in order to continue pushing what they were always going to push to begin with. It's a fucking joke. Anti-racism and solidarity should be seen as verbs. They require us to do something about racism. And in order for us to do something about racism, first and foremost, we have to redefine it and give it multiple different definitions. Everything from over to invert to unconscious to subtle to environmental to colonial to systemic to institutional, etc., etc. There are so many different variations of racism now because they need to have as many as possible in order to attack every facet of society and white people and their whiteness. And on that note, I think I probably would say we are done. And the Black Lives Matter movement gets a mention, yada yada, but I think I've done enough. Just goes to show that this fucking nonsense, it's just nonsense. They don't have a leg to stand on. And that's why they continuously insist on bullshitting and gaslighting to push their cancer. Fucking